Secrets of the Murdaugh Family. A Dark Legacy. Unveiled. For over a century, one family controlled the law in South Carolina, but their reign was built on dark secrets and suspicious deaths. We're unveiling the complete story behind the Murdaugh dynasty's fall, from their iron grip on power to the murder trial that exposed everything. It begins with a voice, calm but haunted, echoing through the stillness of South Carolina's low country, a place where the air feels heavy with secrets, and the rivers seem to remember everything. The land is beautiful, quiet, but it hides stories that people prefer not to tell. For over a century, one family stood above the rest. The Murdaughs. Lawyers, prosecutors, and power brokers who shaped justice itself. They didn't just work within the system. They were the system. Their name opened doors, silenced rumors, and ended investigations before they even began. In the town of Hampton, their influence was everywhere. From the courthouse steps to the dinner tables of ordinary families, everyone knew who they were. If you needed help, you went to the Murdaughs. If you crossed them, you prayed you'd live to regret it. The story starts in the early 1900s with Randolph Murdaugh Sr., a man with sharp eyes and ambition burning like fire. He opened a small law office that would later grow into a local empire. In a county where money was scarce, his power came from something greater: control. By 1920, Randolph became the solicitor, the local prosecutor. That role would stay in the family for 3 generations, passing like a crown from father to son. For over 80 years, someone with the Murdaugh name decided who went to prison and who walked free. The Murdaughs weren't just a family, they were a dynasty. And in small southern towns, dynasties don't just fade away, they build walls, protect their own, and bury their mistakes deep in the ground. People whispered about strange things that happened near the family's properties. Mysterious accidents, sudden deaths, investigations that went cold before they even began. But no one spoke too loudly. It was dangerous to accuse the Murdaughs of anything. Their reach stretched through every corner of the justice system. If you were arrested, chances were the prosecutor was a Murdaugh. If you were injured, the lawyer defending you might be a Murdaugh. And if you worked for the sheriff's office, you probably owed your job to one. Decades passed, and the family grew richer and more untouchable. They hunted on vast lands, owned riverfront homes, and lived behind smiles that looked friendly, but never quite felt warm. To the outside world, they were a symbol of Southern respectability. But power has a price, and every generation that inherited the Murdaugh name also inherited the darkness that came with it. By the time Alex Murdaugh was born, the empire was already legendary. He grew up surrounded by privilege, destined to carry the family torch. He became a lawyer just like his father and grandfather, slipping naturally into the world of influence and quiet control. But Alex wasn't like the men before him. He had charm, but it was shallow. Confidence, but without conscience. He loved money, status, and attention, but he didn't love the truth. For years, he maintained the image of a respected lawyer, a loving husband to Maggie, and a proud father to their 2 sons, Buster and Paul. The family posed for photos that showed Southern charm at its best: smiling faces, expensive homes, laughter around the dinner table. But beneath that, cracks were forming. The first signs came quietly: missing money from client accounts, whispered suspicions of fraud, stories of Alex using his position to manipulate settlements. But no one confronted him. The Murdaugh name was still sacred in Hampton County, and when you own the courthouse, no one questions your balance sheet. Then came the younger son, Paul. Reckless, spoiled, and dangerously confident. He grew up knowing his last name was a shield. If he broke the law, his family would fix it. If he hurt someone, they would make it disappear. In February 2019, Paul drove his family's boat into the darkness of Archer's Creek. He was drunk, loud, and laughing. With him were his friends, including a young woman named Mallory Beach. When the boat crashed into a bridge piling, Mallory was thrown into the freezing water. Her body was found a week later. The community was devastated. Everyone knew who had been driving. But when investigators showed up, something strange happened. They hesitated. Reports were inconsistent. Evidence disappeared. Paul's name never appeared in the initial arrest records. The Murdaugh power machine was working again. Still, the public pressure grew. The case became national news. People demanded accountability. For the first time, the Murdaugh shield started to crack. Then came tragedy again, but this time, it would shake the foundation of everything. June 7th, 2021. A calm night in Moselle, the family's sprawling hunting estate. Maggie and Paul were found shot to death near the dog kennels. It was Alex who called 911, his voice trembling, his words panicked. He said he had just returned home and found their bodies. He said he had no idea who could have done this. The scene was brutal. The police report described multiple gunshot wounds, chaos and blood spread across the gravel. It was the kind of crime that looked personal. At first, people pitied Alex, the grieving husband, the devastated father. But as the investigation went on, the sympathy began to fade. The timeline didn't fit. His behavior after the murders seemed rehearsed. And when police asked for his phone records, he hesitated. It felt like he was hiding something. Then came the discovery that would change everything. A short video recorded by Paul just minutes before his death. It was meant for something harmless, but in the background a voice could be heard, calm, familiar, and unmistakable. It was Alex Murdaugh. The man who swore he wasn't there was caught at the scene. From that moment, his story collapsed. Investigators started digging deeper, and what they found was far worse than anyone expected. Financial crimes, stolen money, forged checks, missing client funds. Alex had been stealing for years, millions of dollars from the very people he represented. The murders suddenly looked different. They weren't random acts of violence. They were desperate acts of control. Alex was drowning in debt, facing exposure for his crimes, and losing the one thing his family valued most: power. Some believed he killed Maggie and Paul to gain sympathy and buy time. Others said it was rage. Whatever the motive, it was the moment the Murdaugh empire began to fall apart. The community that once feared them now turned on them. Every secret, every whisper, every quiet cover-up was dragged into the light. Old cases were reopened. People began to talk about other deaths connected to the family. Their housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, found dead after a mysterious fall. Stephen Smith, the teenager whose suspicious death had been buried for years. The web of lies that took a century to build was unraveling, and Alex was at the center of it. But this was only the beginning. The investigation would soon reveal how deep the corruption went, how far the Murdaugh name had stretched into every corner of South Carolina's justice system, and how a family built on power could destroy itself from the inside. The story wasn't about one murder. It was about a legacy of control, greed, and deceit passed down like a curse. And now, after generations of silence, that curse had finally come to collect. The night after the murders, Moselle was no longer a quiet hunting lodge. Police lights cut through the darkness. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. The land that had once symbolized the Murdaugh's wealth now looked like the scene of a nightmare. Alex Murdaugh stood there, pale, broken, wrapped in shock. Or at least that was the image he wanted everyone to believe. He told officers that he had been visiting his sick mother at the time of the murders. He said when he returned, he found Maggie and Paul lying near the kennels, unresponsive. His tone was heavy with grief, his words shaky. But investigators who spoke to him that night noticed something strange. He cried, but there were no tears. He spoke like a man performing for an audience. The crime scene was messy but calculated. 2 guns were used, both owned by the Murdaughs. One was a shotgun, the other an assault-style rifle. There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever had killed Maggie and Paul knew the property. They were comfortable there. At first, the police were careful. This was not just any family. This was the Murdaughs. Even in 2021, their power still cast a long shadow. Investigators treaded carefully, knowing any misstep could spark backlash. But as hours turned into days, cracks appeared in Alex's story. Phone records didn't line up. Data from the car revealed inconsistencies in his timeline. And that small video, the one Paul had taken just minutes before he died, told its own truth. It was recorded at the kennels. Around 8:44 p.m., in it you can hear the dogs barking, water splashing, voices overlapping. Then in the background, calm and distinct, came Alex's voice. He was there. His own son had unknowingly captured the proof that would one day destroy him. For a while, investigators stayed quiet. They needed more. Meanwhile, Alex played his role as the grieving father. He attended the funerals, shaking hands, accepting condolences, saying things like, "Who would do this to my family?" But behind that sorrow was a storm of lies ready to burst open, because Alex's life was collapsing long before the murders. His law firm, one of the oldest and most respected in South Carolina, was beginning to see irregularities. Millions of dollars were missing. Client trust funds had been drained. Partners were asking questions. Behind the walls of that prestigious office, Alex was stealing money from accident victims, from widows, even from orphans. He had been doing it for years. He forged checks, created fake accounts, and moved money like a magician performing a cruel trick. By 2021, his empire of theft was crumbling. He was drowning in debt. He owed millions. Banks were calling. Lawsuits were coming. The illusion was falling apart. And then Maggie and Paul were murdered. Some believed it was coincidence. Others saw something more deliberate. A desperate man cornered by his own crimes doing something unthinkable to buy sympathy and time. But the fall of the Murdaugh family was not just about one man. It was about generations of unchecked power. It was about what happens when a family becomes too big to question, too powerful to punish. For decades, the Murdaughs had made friends in every department. Police, judges, prosecutors, they all knew each other. If you were arrested in Hampton County, you hoped a Murdaugh didn't have a stake in your case, because if they did, your fate was already sealed. Locals often said, "You can't win against a Murdaugh." It was a warning whispered in bars and diners. A quiet truth people had accepted for nearly a century, but that truth was now cracking apart. The media began circling the story. First local papers, then national outlets. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know who Alex Murdaugh really was. And as the spotlight grew brighter, more bodies surfaced, figuratively and literally. The first was Gloria Satterfield, the Murdaugh's longtime housekeeper. In 2018, she supposedly tripped and fell on the front steps of their home, suffering fatal injuries. The story seemed simple, but when investigators re-examined it, it made little sense. No official accident report, no autopsy, and most strangely, the family claimed Gloria mentioned the dogs as the cause just before she died, something no one could verify after her death. Alex convinced Gloria's sons to file a wrongful death claim against him, promising to help them get an insurance payout. They trusted him. But when the settlement came through, Alex kept every penny. Over $4 million. Gloria's sons got nothing. Then came the case of Stephen Smith. Back in 2015, Stephen's body was found in the middle of a rural road not far from Murdaugh territory. His injuries didn't match a hit and run. There were signs of blunt force trauma, but the case was quickly closed. Locals whispered Stephen had been close to Buster Murdaugh, Alex's older son. Police were pressured to stay quiet. The file was buried. For years, these stories stayed hidden, just fragments of rumor. But now, with Maggie and Paul gone and Alex under suspicion, every buried truth started clawing its way to the surface. As investigators dug deeper, they saw the pattern: money, manipulation, and a trail of unexplained deaths circling one powerful name. Then, in September 2021, the story took another bizarre turn. Alex Murdaugh was shot in the head while changing a tire on a rural road. He survived. At first, he said a stranger had pulled up and fired at him. The community was stunned. First his family, now him. But the truth came out fast. The shooting was staged. Alex had hired a man named Curtis Smith to kill him, so his surviving son Buster could collect $10 million in insurance money. The bullet barely grazed him. The plan failed, and with that failure, the mask finally fell off. The man who once prosecuted others was now the criminal. The man who had controlled the system now faced it. Police arrested him not for the murders yet, but for fraud and conspiracy. Then came the financial charges, over 100 counts, each one a small piece of a giant puzzle showing how Alex had built his fortune on deceit. But beneath all of that, investigators kept circling back to Moselle, to Maggie and Paul. Why were they killed? Was it revenge, panic, or cold calculation? In court, prosecutors painted a picture of a desperate man cornered by his lies. The financial scandal was closing in. His wife and son knew the truth, and in one night of chaos, he decided to erase the witnesses closest to him. Alex, still confident, denied everything. He said he loved his family. He said someone else did it. But every time he spoke, more contradictions appeared. The video, the weapons, the timeline, the lies about where he was. One by one, the details locked into place like iron bars around him. The small town that once bowed to the Murdaughs now watched as their empire burned in public view. News vans parked outside the courthouse. Journalists dug into archives. The Murdaughs' law firm changed its name. desperate to cut ties with the scandal. Alex Murdaugh, the man who had once controlled the law, was now being devoured by it. And yet, even as his world crumbled, there were still whispers of something bigger. Unanswered questions, hidden players, the sense that not every secret had been exposed, because when a dynasty falls, it doesn't collapse cleanly. It unravels, slowly, painfully, piece by piece. The Murdaugh legacy was not done haunting South Carolina. The trial was coming. And with it, every lie, every secret, and every dark corner of their power was about to be laid bare for the world to see. The courthouse in Walterboro, South Carolina, stood like a relic of the past. Red brick walls, tall white columns, and the kind of Southern charm that hid decades of silent judgment. But this time the place wasn't filled with routine hearings or small-town disputes. It was about to host the most talked-about murder trial in modern American history. People came from across the country to see it. Some were locals who had lived their entire lives under the Murdaugh shadow. Others were reporters, camera crews, and true crime followers drawn by the scandal. For the first time in a century, the Murdaugh name didn't command respect. It drew curiosity, disbelief, and anger. Alex Murdaugh walked into court in a dark suit. His once confident posture was replaced with something else. Fatigue, maybe fear, or maybe just the weight of exposure. He had been stripped of everything that once defined him: his job, his money, his reputation, and the illusion of control. But even now there was something about him that felt manipulative. A man used to talking his way out of anything, still believing words could save him. The prosecution was clear and methodical. They didn't just want to prove Alex killed his wife and son. They wanted to show how decades of power and deceit led to that night at Moselle. They wanted the jury to see not just a killer, but a dynasty collapsing under its own lies. They began with motive. Alex's financial empire was falling apart. He was weeks away from being exposed as a thief. His law firm had confronted him about missing money, and his secrets were piling up. The murders, prosecutors said, were his desperate attempt to distract from his crimes. If Maggie and Paul were killed, the sympathy would shield him. Investigations would slow. He would regain control. Then came the evidence. The video. The timeline. The weapons. Every piece pointed back to one man. Paul's cell phone video became the centerpiece of the trial. When the courtroom played it, the room fell silent. The sound of barking dogs filled the air. You could hear Paul's voice, Maggie's voice, and then, unmistakably, Alex's voice. Calm, familiar, casual. It was 8:44 p.m., just minutes before the murders. Alex had always insisted he was nowhere near the kennels. He told police he was visiting his mother, but the video shattered that lie. The jury heard the proof straight from the victim's own phone. After the video came the digital data. Cell tower records showed Alex's movements that night. His phone had been idle for nearly an hour during the estimated time of the killings, then suddenly sprang to life. Texts, calls, steps recorded on his health app, all at once as if he were staging a normal routine after the crime. Prosecutors said this wasn't coincidence. It was choreography. Alex had turned off his phone during the murders, then turned it back on to create an alibi. Then came the gun evidence. The weapons used matched ones owned by the family. Neither gun was ever recovered, but spent shell casings from the same type of ammunition were found elsewhere on the property. The math was simple. Whoever killed Maggie and Paul had access to their home, their guns, and their trust. Still, the defense pushed back. They said Alex was a grieving father being framed by circumstantial evidence. They called the investigation sloppy. They said law enforcement, embarrassed by their mistakes, had made Alex the perfect villain. They brought up his addiction to painkillers, his mental struggles, and his long history of service as a lawyer. They painted him as flawed but human. Broken, not evil. But the prosecution wasn't done. They called witness after witness to reveal how deep Alex's lies went. Financial crimes, fraud, deception. More than 70 clients defrauded, millions stolen. It wasn't just corruption. It was a lifetime of manipulation. When the lead prosecutor stood before the jury, he said something that echoed through the room. This is a man who has lived his entire life lying to people. He lied to clients, he lied to colleagues, he lied to his family, and now he is lying to you. Then, in one of the most dramatic moments in recent courtroom history, Alex Murdaugh himself took the stand. The crowd held its breath. The man who had once commanded courtrooms as a prosecutor now stood as the accused. He looked at the jury, eyes red, voice trembling. He admitted to lying. He admitted to stealing. He admitted to being addicted to opioids, but he swore on his life that he did not kill his wife and son. For hours he spoke, calm at times, tearful at others. He described Maggie as the love of his life, Paul as his wild-hearted boy. He told the jury he lied about being at the kennels because he didn't trust law enforcement, because he was paranoid, because his addiction clouded his mind. But the prosecution didn't let him escape that easily. They pressed him on every contradiction, every timeline inconsistency, every lie he had told since the night of the murders, and slowly, his story began to fall apart again. One prosecutor asked, "Mr. Murdaugh, when you looked at the jury and swore you didn't lie about being at the kennels, were you lying then too?" Alex hesitated, then said quietly, "Yes." The room went silent. That single admission, spoken softly, almost regretfully, was enough to shift everything. The man who had lied for decades had finally admitted to one lie too many. As the days went on, the evidence piled higher. Experts explained the trajectory of the gunfire, the movement of the bodies, and the timing of the phone activity. Everything pointed toward Alex being there in that small window of time when Maggie and Paul were killed. But beyond the evidence, there was something deeper, something emotional. The jury watched a man who had once stood for power, who had lived above consequence, now stripped bare. The image of privilege and confidence was gone. All that remained was a desperate man trying to rewrite a story already written. Outside the courtroom, people gathered under the oak trees. Some said justice was finally catching up with the Murdaughs. Others said it was all too strange, too neat, too perfect. But one thing was clear: the dynasty was dead. The trial went on for weeks. Every day brought another revelation. More fraud, more betrayal. Even after the murders, Alex had continued manipulating people. He had stolen money meant for victims' families, used friends to hide assets, and even tried to fake his own death. It wasn't just one crime. It was a lifetime of rot. When closing arguments began, the prosecutor's voice was calm but sharp. Greed, control, deception. That's what drove this man. His life was crumbling, his lies were closing in, and the people who knew the truth were Maggie and Paul. So he silenced them. The defense countered that the state had built a theory, not proof. They said Alex's life of lies didn't make him a murderer. They said he had lost everything and deserved pity, not punishment. But by then, it didn't matter. The jury had seen the truth for themselves. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury went into deliberation. It took them less than 3 hours to decide. When they returned, the room was silent. The verdict was read, guilty on all counts. Alex Murdaugh showed little reaction. His face was blank, eyes hollow. The same courtrooms that once obeyed his voice now sentenced him to life in prison. The crowd outside erupted, some in relief, some in disbelief. The century-long reign of the Murdaughs was over, but even as the gavel fell, the story didn't end. Investigations into the family's past were still ongoing. The deaths of Gloria Satterfield and Stephen Smith were being reopened. Old files were being pulled from dusty drawers. The ghosts of the Low Country were still speaking. Alex was in prison, but the family's darkness was far from buried. The empire had collapsed, but the echoes of its corruption still reached into every corner of South Carolina's justice system. And behind the bars of a cold cell, Alex Murdaugh sat alone, no longer a king, no longer untouchable, just another man waiting for time to erase his name. But time would not erase this story. Because when power becomes corruption, when greed becomes murder, the fall is never forgotten. The Low Country would never be the same again. The verdict echoed far beyond the courthouse walls. It spread through the quiet streets of Hampton County, through the swamps and rivers of the Low Country, through every small town where the Murdaugh name had once meant authority. For the first time in living memory, the family that had ruled South Carolina's justice system for generations had been brought down by it. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as Alex Murdaugh was led away in handcuffs. The same red hair that once made him recognizable at charity events and legal conferences was now the face of a convicted murderer. The people watching were silent. Some cried, some cheered, but most just stared, as if trying to believe that the impossible had finally happened. In the weeks that followed, the country could not look away. News networks replayed the trial highlights, podcasts dissected every testimony, and documentaries began to form around the story. The Murdaughs had become a symbol, not just of crime, but of what unchecked power does to a family and a community. For years, their influence had seeped into every part of life in the Low Country. They donated to schools, sponsored events, hired locals, and built friendships with police and judges. Many people had admired them. Others had feared them. But now, with Alex behind bars, their name carried a new weight, one made of guilt, suspicion, and shame. The once proud family law firm, Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Elsroth, and Dietrich, quickly removed the Murdaugh name from its letterhead. It was an attempt to distance itself from the scandal that had consumed it. The firm had been the cornerstone of the Murdaugh empire for over a century, representing thousands of clients across South Carolina. But now it was a symbol of betrayal and corruption. The financial crimes alone would have been enough to ruin any man. Alex had embezzled more than $10 million from clients, friends, and even his own family. He had used fake accounts to reroute settlement money, stealing from the very people who trusted him most. Every case revealed new victims, new lies, new layers of deception. And yet what haunted people most were the deaths. The trail of lives connected to the Murdaughs that had ended under strange, often suspicious circumstances. After Alex's conviction, investigators began re-examining every one of them. The death of Gloria Satterfield was first. Her sons, who had once been manipulated by Alex into signing away their settlement, finally saw some justice. The insurance company sued Alex to recover the stolen funds, and the Satterfields received a portion of what was rightfully theirs. But no amount of money could erase the questions surrounding her death. Why had no coroner ever filed a report? Why had her body never been autopsied? And why did Alex, almost immediately after her fall, speak to insurance adjusters himself, guiding the process that made him millions? Then came the case of Stephen Smith. His death had been buried under layers of silence since 2015. After the trial, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division reopened the investigation, officially naming it a homicide. For years, people had whispered about Stephen's connection to the Murdaughs, about how his death was never properly explained, about the fear that surrounded the case. Now, for the first time, there was hope that his story would be told truthfully. But beyond the murders and the money, there was something deeper, something more unsettling. It was the way power had shaped the community. In Hampton County, people had grown used to looking the other way. When a Murdaugh's name appeared in a report, the document often disappeared. When someone complained about unfair treatment, no one listened. For generations, the family's authority had been accepted as normal. It had become part of the landscape, like the moss on the trees or the still water in the marshes. Now, that illusion was gone. The courthouse, once a stage for the Murdaughs' victories, had become the site of their public humiliation. But it wasn't just the end of a dynasty. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Judges, officers, and local officials faced questions about their relationships with the family. Old cases were reopened. Reporters dug through archives that no one had touched in decades. One by one, pieces of the puzzle emerged, painting a picture of a system that had long served power instead of truth. In the months after Alex's sentencing, new charges continued to appear: fraud, money laundering, tax evasion. It became clear that even from prison, his crimes were still being uncovered. The prosecutors called it the most complex criminal web in South Carolina's history. Alex was transferred to a maximum security prison, where he began serving his life sentence. Gone were the tailored suits, the courtroom confidence, and the easy charm. In their place was a gray uniform, cold concrete, and silence. Inside his cell, he received letters from strangers. Some expressed sympathy, others called him a monster. He read them all, but the world outside moved on, leaving him behind as a relic of greed and arrogance. Meanwhile, his surviving son, Buster, tried to live quietly, avoiding the spotlight that had once shone on his family. But even he couldn't escape the shadow of the name. Reporters followed him. Documentaries speculated about his past. Every move he made was dissected, every friendship questioned. The sins of the father had become the burden of the son. For South Carolina, the fall of the Murdaughs was more than a crime story. It was a mirror. It showed how easily power can twist justice, how silence can protect corruption, and how truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to surface. The people of the Low Country began to talk openly for the first time. Old secrets came out. Stories that had been whispered in kitchens and bars were now spoken aloud. The fear that once protected the Murdaughs had finally faded, but some still asked a difficult question. If Alex hadn't been caught on video, would justice ever have come? Would the system that served the Murdaughs for generations have ever turned against them? That question lingered in the humid air, unanswered. Because even though Alex Murdaugh had been convicted, the system that allowed his family's power to thrive for a century remained. The alliances, the favors, the unspoken rules, they didn't disappear overnight. It was as if the soil of the Low Country itself held the memory of corruption, absorbing it, feeding it, waiting for the next name, the next family, the next story, but this time people were watching. This time the illusion had shattered. Alex's trial became a warning to anyone who believed they were untouchable. His family's story became a lesson written in headlines and documentaries. Power without conscience always ends in ruin. At the heart of it all was one simple truth. The Murdaughs believed they owned justice. But justice, slow and silent, had been watching all along, and when it finally arrived, it took everything from them. The story of the Murdaugh family became more than a crime. It became a reflection of how far privilege and corruption can reach when left unchecked. What had begun as a local scandal turned into a national obsession. It revealed not just the downfall of one man, but the decay of an entire system built on silence and influence. The news didn't stop after Alex's conviction. Every week new revelations surfaced. Financial records, testimonies, and hidden accounts. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of how deeply Alex had manipulated everyone around him. He hadn't simply stolen money. He had exploited trust itself, using people's grief and pain for profit. Lawyers who once worked beside him said they had never suspected the scale of his deception. Clients who had lost loved ones in accidents realized the settlements they received had been gutted. The Murdaugh legacy, once seen as a pillar of justice, now symbolized betrayal. Outside South Carolina, people began to recognize the pattern. The story wasn't just about the Murdaughs. It was about power, about how easily one family can twist justice when no one dares to say no, about how wealth and charm can disguise rot until tragedy forces it into the light. The media turned the case into a modern parable. Documentaries, podcasts, and books appeared within months. Each tried to explain how it had all gone so wrong. But the truth was simple. The Murdaughs had lived for generations believing rules didn't apply to them. When that belief met reality, everything collapsed. In the Low Country, life moved slowly again. The rivers flowed as they always had, calm and indifferent. The courthouses reopened for ordinary cases. But something had changed. The spell of the Murdaugh name was broken. People spoke openly now about what they had always known but never dared to say. The local police began reviewing cases connected to the family. Files that had gathered dust for decades were reopened. Investigators re-examined autopsy reports, property records, and insurance claims. Slowly, piece by piece, the truth that had been buried under generations of influence began to surface. Stephen Smith's case, once dismissed as an accident, was now a homicide investigation. His mother, who had fought for years to be heard, finally saw attention shift toward her son's death. She said she had never wanted revenge. She only wanted the truth. And now, after years of silence, she was finally getting it. The Satterfield family, too, found closure in truth. They spoke publicly about their betrayal, not to relive the pain, but to warn others about blind trust. Their words carried weight in a community that had once bowed to the Murdaughs. But beyond the cases, beyond the headlines, there was something more personal happening. The story changed how people saw power. It changed how they saw justice. For decades, people in small southern towns believed that some families were untouchable. They believed the law served the powerful first and the people second. The Murdaugh trial shattered that belief. It showed that even the most protected name could fall, that even a man who had controlled the system could one day be crushed by it. Alex's own words during sentencing were strange. He maintained his innocence, saying he loved his wife and son and would never harm them. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. The judge looked at him and said, "It might not have been you the first time, but it sure as hell was you the last time." The words hung in the air, final and heavy. In prison, Alex became a ghost of the man he once was. The confidence was gone. The charisma was gone. The control was gone. He lived alone in a small cell, far from the red soil and open fields of the low country he once ruled. Reporters who tried to visit him described him as distant, quiet, and oddly polite. He answered questions with the same charm he once used to win juries. But behind his eyes was emptiness. Some said he still believed he would one day prove his innocence. Others said he had accepted his fate. Outside, people argued about what justice really meant. Some said his conviction was proof that no one was above the law. Others said it came too late, that the system had protected him until it no longer could. Both were right. The Murdaugh story left scars on South Carolina's justice system. It exposed a culture of favoritism, where personal connections mattered more than evidence. It forced the state to confront uncomfortable truths about class, privilege, and power. It reminded everyone that justice must be earned, not inherited. In the end, what destroyed the Murdaughs wasn't one lie. It was the accumulation of thousands of small ones. Lies told to clients, to friends, to family, and finally to the world. Each lie was a thread, and when one snapped, the entire fabric unraveled. There is a saying in the Low Country that everything hidden eventually comes back with the tide. That's what happened here. The truth buried for generations rose slowly, pulled by something greater than power or fear. It rose because it had to. Today, the old Murdaugh estate in Moselle sits quiet. The kennels are empty. The grass has grown tall. The laughter and shouting that once filled those fields are gone. The place feels heavy, as if the land itself remembers. People still drive by sometimes. They slow down, look through the trees, and think about what happened there. Not just the murders, but everything that led to them. The greed, the arrogance, the belief that consequences were for other people. The story of the Murdaughs is a warning now. A reminder that power built on lies always collapses, that control built on fear never lasts, and that no matter how strong a name becomes, truth will always outlive it. Alex Murdaugh's trial ended, but the story never truly closed. The echoes of his crime still ripple through courtrooms, through families who trusted him, through a community learning how to rebuild faith in justice. The Murdaugh dynasty began with ambition and ended with ruin. It spanned 3 generations of power, wealth, and secrecy. For a century, they ruled the law in South Carolina, and in the end, it was the law that destroyed them. Now, when people in the Low Country talk about justice, they no longer whisper. They speak clearly, knowing that silence is what allowed the darkness to grow. They know now that power without conscience is only a mask, and when it slips, the truth always waits beneath. The rivers of South Carolina keep moving, slow and endless, just like they did before the Murdaughs rose and fell. But the land will never forget. The story remains heavy and unforgettable, a dark legacy finally unveiled.